back to my channel. I'm here with another astrology oracle reading for you. Today is September 19th and we are looking at a chart for Dayton, Ohio at 11:11 a.m. This gives us a Virgo sun, a Scorpio rising, and a Cancer moon. The chart has retained that kite shape that we saw last week as well, thanks to trines between Mercury and Pluto, Pluto and Uranus and the Sun, as well as some sextiles between Pluto and Neptune and Uranus. In addition to this kite shape, we are also seeing a trine between Venus and Uranus. We're also seeing some oppositions. So those oppositions have also retained from last week. We have actually an exact opposition today between Mercury and Jupiter, both at 4 degrees. And we have another opposition that is not exact, but is very close between the Sun and Neptune. Neptune's at 23 degrees and the Sun is at 26. So as I've mentioned in the past, in order for an aspect or a transit or any of these terminologies you want to use, in order for them to be considered exact, you will have to have the same degree symbols or the same degree for both of the zodiac signs. So that is why with Mercury at 4 degrees and Jupiter at 4 degrees in opposing signs between Libra and Aries, we have an exact opposition. So that can be actually kind of a tricky experience when we have Mercury and Jupiter involved. It can certainly make us a little bit paranoid, perhaps a little bit skeptical. Our thoughts can really run wild. And that's because anything that Jupiter touches, it expands. So with Jupiter, making this channel of communication, you could say, with the planet of communication, you could certainly have a lot of brilliant ideas and a lot of really good perspective and expanding your mind, especially if you are making use of Mercury retrograde by doing the rule of Rees. But it can also, like I said, kind of come out as some paranoia or inflated perspectives. Something just to be aware of since it's there. And interestingly, both Jupiter and Mercury are retrograde. So although I've talked quite a lot about Mercury retrograde, that is not the only planet that's retrograde right now. That would be way too easy. Not only do we have Mercury and Jupiter, we also have Saturn, Uranus, Neptune, and Pluto all retrograde. So yeah, it's kind of a murky energy. I've been seeing some of my clients have some very vivid dreams, a lot of processing, exes coming back up into their life, which is very typical for this time. But these are exes that they've had like long-term relationships with. I've also seen like the same for friendships. So people who have heard from someone they've not, talked to in a long time, or who are thinking about reaching out to someone they've not talked to in a long time. Because we have Saturn retrograde, Saturn is the keeper of time, so to speak, Chronos, and it is really putting some pressure on the millennials who are going through their Saturn return or who have gone through their Saturn return, especially if you are anywhere between like 17 to like 24 degrees. This retrograde has just really been digging in. And that Saturn again is, it is in some dynamic energy. It's squaring Uranus, it's trining Mars, a lot going on. So it's a little bit of an astrology check-in. If you are interested in a more in-depth horoscope, or if you're, looking for weekly astrology updates that go into a little bit more detail than what these videos might, then definitely consider subscribing to my newsletter, because I send out weekly dispatches with exactly that. All right. Let's get these cards laid out. Hard to believe this is the 27th video, 27th week in a row that we have pulled from these cards. Pretty amazing. I was finding early on that I would sometimes pull duplicates, so I started taking out of the deck cards that I have already read for you all, just so we can continue this as a very genuine learning experience, as much as it is intuitive. All right. And we have the 7th house, partners. So in this chart, we have the descendant is in Taurus, meaning that the 7th house starts in Taurus. This is similar to how, like with the rising sign in this chart is Scorpio, the 1st house starts with Scorpio energy. So we are looking at Taurus energy. There is a little peekaboo of some Gemini involved because I do use a Placidus house system and not whole sign houses. But for the sake of this conversation, we will focus a little bit more on Taurus. So again, we have Taurus and the North Node, Uranus and the North Node in Taurus. Taurus has really been a very dominant energy this year because of that eclipse axis. And, you know, depending on where you're at and what time that you cast a chart, it's possible that Taurus won't rule the 7th house and that, you know, Uranus and North Node fall into another space. But again, for the sake of this reading, this is the chart we're using. So the 7th house, partners. This is a really interesting space because it's all about intimacy, and intimacy doesn't necessarily mean romance. So as much as you could be romantic partners, you could also be like business partners or like an assistant, somebody that has very personal and direct knowledge, information, and access to you. But, you know, again, whether or not romance is involved is kind of an entirely different thing. You can look to the 7th house to get an idea for what quality partner that you are and, you know, kind of what you can bring to the table, as much as the kind of partners that you are attracting and that you're trying to bring into your life. So if we are working with this chart and Taurus in the 7th house, you know, from a chart like this, we're seeing a call towards partners who are of the same value system because Venus does rule Taurus. It would be very difficult for someone who has Taurus in the 7th house to be partnered with someone who has very, very, very different set of values than them, or who just does not see eye to eye on like very deep personal matters, because this is a house of intimacy. This isn't superficial. This isn't, you know, very surface level stuff. This is like deep and meaningful. So the 7th house is, you know, depending on what planets you have sitting in there, again, is a great indicator of how you view marriage, of how you view sort of a combining of energies between two people, right? Like, are you looking to be the dominant one in that partnership? Are you looking to have more of an equal partnership? A lot of that information can be indicated from the 7th house. Now, the 7th house is opposite to the 1st house. So we associate the 7th house with Libra, again, Venus, which makes a lot of sense because even with Taurus, who's also ruled by Venus, when you're forming that intimate partnership, having some sort of respect and like baseline like value system, again, that's like my favorite word to associate with Venus, is very, very important here. Whether we're talking, you know, again, Libra, Taurus, or perhaps another sign, there is an indication of shared values here. Now, the merged energies really comes in more into the 8th house when we start getting involved into like sex and birth and death and transformation. But in the 7th house, we're still looking at, again, forming a union. Opposite to the 1st house, and the 1st house is associated with Aries. So this is like our life force, our energy, our motivation, you know. So if you have planets in the 1st house, let's say Saturn, for example, it could be that you have very low levels of energy, or that you are very rigid in asserting boundaries, or perhaps need to become more rigid in asserting boundaries. And so when we seek to balance and we go to the opposite house, the 7th house, it is very necessary to have some partner, or if you are married or coupled, that person really respects what you're actually dealing with in your physical body before you make it to the point where you can be coupled with someone else. So again, Saturn in the 1st house, you know, you could be just a little bit lethargic, or you, again, could have very serious boundaries, and partnering with someone that does not respect either of those things is probably not going to lead to a very long union between the two. Again, whether it's business partners, very, very close friends, platonic lovers, whatever, however you want to kind of spell it out, it would be necessary that, you know, even if you don't have full autonomy in your birth chart, that you do within your relationship. 7th house, you know, it is kind of a lighter space, but depending on your life experience and your upbringing and some of the positions that you have present, it, you know, you could be very reserved. towards partnerships. You know, like let's say you have Saturn in the 7th house. I've heard this be described as, you know, growing up and seeing one parent be gone a lot, or a lot of the burden of responsibility being placed on one parent. And we take those experiences with us into adulthood, and you know, sometimes we very consciously make decisions around those experiences, but more often than not, we end up making very subconscious decisions and honestly repeating patterns, you know. And within the 7th house, you know, we're just past the halfway point between the zodiac and all of the different houses and everything. So, you know, by this point, a lot of that like very personal, very intimate, at home, you know, daily life, sense of security, all of that has actually already been, you know, worked its way through, because the 1st through the 6th houses really do deal with a lot of those things. So, you know, in essence, as you're traveling through the chart and learning about yourself, before you make it to the partnership, you have to figure out who you are. You have to find a sense of security. You have to find your voice, figure out, you know, how do you apply lessons from where you come from, work in your own sense of creativity and passion, and find your daily routines. That is 1 through 6 houses. And by the time you get to 7 and start making your way through 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, you're dealing with other people and the outside world a lot more than the previous 6 chapters, where, like I said, a lot of it's early childhood, a lot of it's, you know, kind of behind closed doors. It's very personal, in your own head stuff. And as you step out into the rest of the chart, starting with the 7th house, the world gets invited in. And, you know, our lived experiences come into play here. But again, whatever planets that we have, you know, up here at the beginning of the chart is going to give a lot of indication for how we maybe project some of those early lived experiences into the rest of the chart. 7th house, let us bang out our little booklet here. Oops. There we go. Marriage is neither heaven nor hell. It is simply purgatory. And that is a quote from Abraham Lincoln. Bindings, whether emotional and domestic, lawful, and what is right or permissible, are indicated here. The 7th house is the area of the chart that represents the other, since it opposes the 1st house of the self. Traditionally, it's been thought to be the house of marriage or marriage partners, although that can still be a primary meaning. The other can also include friends, families, or peer groups. It can mean that significant others, such as coworkers, since it's the traditional house of Libra, it governs fairness, balance, and the law. It also is the house of open enemies. That's kind of interesting, because the 12th house is hidden enemies. And again, this is when we finally break away from like the bottom part of the chart, where it's all really like personal and at home, and the world is getting invited in. And the first indicator here could be open enemies. When the 7th house card presents itself in a reading, it usually means one of two things: either issues with partners and significant others, or court cases and legal issues. The card itself is neutral, much like the actual 7th house, which strives for balance. So the surrounding cards could also indicate further meaning. We are not pulling any other cards, just something to note if you happen to have this deck and pull more. Misinformation or lying could be a part of the situation. If the card is referring to some kind of legal issue, this is not a great time for that, which of course is not Mercury retrograde, right? And, you know, again, as we've indicated, the ruler of the 7th house, in addition to being, you know, somewhat Taurus energy, is really Libra, and Libra is actually where Mercury is stationed right now, retrograde. Issues of domination and control can come up. It can apply to partnerships and legal rulings. There can also be something around sweetening deals or making things more positive within some kind of negotiation, setup, and discussion between two people. It can also indicate a flourishing romantic or domestic partnership. The 7th house on a very mundane level means engagements, relationships, or taking things to the next level. Partnerships becoming more settled, gaining maturity. It can also imply getting ready for a more serious relationship. So like, you know, again, with Mercury retrograde, we apply that rule of reason, we do the processing. So, you know, if you are someone who is like, you know, either considering proposing to your beloved or accepting that proposal, you know, this is definitely a really great time to think about like what that means for your life and what it means to take it to the next level. Yeah, again, this is really all about others, commitment, flirting, talking, domestic partnerships, marriage, soulmates, partnering, alliances, engagements, contracts, legalities of all different kinds. You know, what I would like to kind of summarize on for this card for this week is, because it's Mercury retrograde, because there's so many planets in so many planets in retrograde, and as I said at the beginning of the video, you know, there are a lot of indicators for like reprocessing and the reemergence of a lot of different people and things. And I said these could be lovers or friends, and this is the 7th house. So if you're feeling, you know, like this is really resonating for you, I would take a look at your own birth chart and see, first of all, what's going in this around the 7th house for you, but also what's going around the 1st house. Because again, that oppositional energy, I always think it's very helpful to be aware of. So let's say you have, you know, Libra ruling your 7th house, you're an Aries rising. This Mercury retrograde is probably really trying your relationship, because it's forcing a bit more of a mature outcome, a bit more of a mature perspective. You know, if you're in couples therapy and there are some things that need to be discussed, this is a really great time to start thinking about what you want to say. Even if you don't get the opportunity to voice those opinions or to voice those thoughts and feelings at this time, you know, using some of that mercurial processing to just really just sit down and think about what you want. Think about, you know, what this person has given you or done for you or done to you. You know, do you want to maintain? Do you want to keep going? Or is it time to call it quits? Is it time to cut that cord? Only you can decide, my love. That's all I have for you this week. As always, it has been a pleasure to read for you. I would love for you to subscribe to the newsletter to get some more astrology reporting. And until next week, bye.